Dear students, in the last lecture, we have discussed the United Nations Secretariat. As I told you that UN Secretariat is the backbone of the UN system because it is this organ of the UN which supports functions and responsibilities of various organs of the United Nations. We have also discussed that Secretariat faces many challenges like funding constraints, political tensions, and operational risks. Despite these challenges, the Secretariat plays an important role in addressing global issues and crises and tries to advance the United Nations objectives and aims and its mission. This secretariat is headed by the Secretary General. In this lecture, we are going to discuss UN Secretary General. UN Secretary General is an important officer within the UN system. He is the Chief Administrative Officer of the United Nations. As an administrative head, the Secretary General is aided by various Deputy Secretary Generals, experts, administrators, and clerks. As you know, that under the League of Nations, Eric Drummond was the first Secretary General. And under the UN, there have been several Secretary Generals till today. Mr. Tragulai from Norway was the first Secretary General of the UN. He remained in office from 1946 to 1953. Secretary General is the highest ranking official within the UN system. The role of Secretary General is important in advancing the goals and principles of the UN Charter, promoting international cooperation and addressing pressing global challenges. The UN Charter's Chapter 15 from Article 97 to 101 contains provisions related to the office of the UN Secretary General. Now we will try to understand that how this important figure within UN is being appointed. Dear students, the appointment of the Secretary General of the United Nations is a significant process that involves careful consideration, consultation, and consensus building among member states. Understanding how the Secretary General is appointed is important for comprehending the leadership structure of the UN and the principles of multilateralism and diplomacy which it contains. Dear students, the selection process of Secretary General begins with informal discussions among member states within the UN Security Council. So, member states of UN Security Council may nominate candidates for the position of Secretary General. However, potential candidates are often diplomats, politicians, or individuals with extensive experience in international affairs. Then the Security Council conducts a series of informal polls to gauge the level of support for each candidate. During these polls, Security Council members indicate whether they encourage, discourage, or have no opinion regarding each candidate. So, after the informal polls, the Security Council proceeds to hold formal, closed door meetings to deliberate on the selection of the Secretary General. So, this process is confidential and Security Council members negotiate behind closed doors to reach a consensus on a single candidate. So, once the Security Council reaches a consensus, it submits a formal recommendation to the General Assembly. This recommendation of the Security Council typically includes the name of the candidate and a brief explanation of the decision, that why this candidate has been selected, has been recommended. So we can say that it is the Security Council which is responsible for recommending candidate to the General Assembly for appointment as the Secretary General. Then the General Assembly considers the Security Council's recommendation and formally appoints the candidate as the Secretary General of the UN. The appointment requires a simple majority vote of the General Assembly's 193 member states. So we can say that recommendation is made by UN Security Council and confirmation is made by the General Assembly about the appointment of the Secretary General of UN. Now we will try to understand that what considerations are being kept in mind while appointing the Secretary General. There is an informal understanding among member states that the position of Secretary General should rotate among different regions of the world. Although this is not a formal requirement, so because of it, over the history of United Nations, Secretaries General have hailed from different regions, including Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. There have also been calls for greater gender balance and diversity in the selection of the Secretary General, with efforts to encourage the nomination of women and candidates from underrepresented regions. While political considerations play an important role in the appointment process, there is an emphasis on selecting candidates based on their qualifications, experience, and ability to effectively lead the United Nations. So we can say the appointment of the Secretary General of the UN is a complex and diplomatic process that reflects the principles of multilateralism, consensus building, and cooperation among member states. By understanding how the Secretary General is appointed, we can gain insight into the workings of the UN and the importance of leadership in addressing global challenges and advancing international peace and security. Dear students, now we are going to discuss the tenure of the Secretary General. The tenure of the UN Secretary General is outlined in the United Nations Charter, and it has evolved through customary practices over the years. As you know, now that the Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly but upon the recommendations of the Security Council. The term of office for the Secretary General is 5 years, with the possibility of his reappointment for another term. Dear students, the UN Charter does not impose term limits on the Secretary General, but there is a customary practice of limiting the tenure to 2 5-year terms. So it means that a person can be appointed as a Secretary General only for 2 terms. This practice is based on the principle of promoting fresh leadership and preventing the concentration of power in the hands of one individual. However, in exceptional circumstances, the General Assembly may decide to give an extension to the Secretary General's term beyond the 2 terms. This decision by the General Assembly requires consensus among member states and is typically based on the Secretary General's performance and the prevailing global context. During transitional periods such as the one end of one Secretary General's term and the beginning of another's, the Deputy Secretary General may assume interim responsibilities to ensure continuity in UN leadership. This transitional period also provides an opportunity for the incoming Secretary General to prepare for assuming office and to engage with member states and UN stakeholders. The Secretary General is subject to oversight and accountability mechanisms established by the General Assembly and the Security Council. These mechanisms may include performance evaluations, financial audits, and investigations into the allegations of misconduct or wrongdoing. The Office of the Secretary General supports the Secretary General in fulfilling his duties and responsibilities, including managing his agenda, coordination with other UN departments and agencies, and representing the UN internationally. So, dear students, each General Secretary brings his own leadership style and priorities, shaping the UN's agenda and legacy during his tenure. Secretaries General may focus on issues such as peace and security, human rights, development, or climate change, depending on the prevailing global challenges and their own expertise and interests. So we can say the tenure of the UN Secretary General is 5 years with the possibility of reappointment, regional rotation, customary term limits, oversight mechanisms, and the Secretary General's unique contributions to the organization's mission and objectives. Dear students, now we are going to discuss the powers and functions of the UN Secretary General. As I told you that the Secretary General is more powerful, more influential than his counterpart under the League of Nations. This is mainly due to 2 reasons. The first reason is that UN Charter gives Secretary General more important powers and functions than did the Covenant of the League of Nations. The first Secretary General of the League, Eric Drummond, did not assume responsibilities of directions and leadership during his term of 13 years. On the other hand, Mr. Draghi Lai, the first Secretary General of the UN, used all the powers given to him by the UN Charter and provided a forceful leadership to the United Nations. So, this unique position held by the Secretary General can be understood by the reference of actual powers and functions given to him by the UN Charter. The functions and powers of the Secretary General are broadly stated in Articles 97 to 102 of the UN Charter. Understanding the powers and functions of the Secretary General is essential to understand his role in advancing the goals and principles of the United Nations. These powers and functions are like the first important power is administrative powers. Article 97 of the UN Charter describes the Secretary General as the Chief Administrative Officer of the UN. The Secretary General of the United Nations holds several administrative powers that are essential for the effective functioning of the organization. These administrative powers enable the Secretary General to oversee the day to day operations of the UN Secretariat, manage personnel, coordinate activities among UN agencies, represent the organization globally, and more. Some of the administrative powers of the UN Secretary General are like the Secretary General has the authority to appoint staff within the UN Secretariat, including senior officials, in accordance with regulations established by the General Assembly. This includes hiring, promotion, transfer, and termination of staff. The Secretary General is also responsible for managing the performance of state and ensuring adherence to UN rules and regulations. The Secretary General also plays an important role in the preparation and submission of the UN budget to the General Assembly. He is responsible for managing the budget effectively, ensuring that the resources are allocated appropriately to support the organization's priorities and activities. The Secretary General also sees financial planning, monitoring, and reporting. Dear students, as you know, that Secretary General is tasked with coordinating the work of UN entities to ensure coherence and cooperation in addressing global challenges. This involves facilitating communication and collaboration among UN agencies, funds, and programs. The Secretary General promotes integrated approaches to issues such as sustainable development, humanitarian assistance, and peace building. The Secretary General also serves as the chief diplomatic representative of the UN. He represents the organization in international forums, negotiations, and diplomatic initiatives. He engages with member states, non governmental organizations, and other stakeholders to promote the UN's objectives and principles. The Secretary General also participates in high level meetings and submits to advance global cooperation and address pressing issues and challenges. The Secretary General also plays a proactive role in preventing and resolving conflicts by using his good offices to facilitate the dialogue and negotiation among conflict parties. He may appoint special envoys or representatives to assist in mediation efforts and to promote peaceful resolution of disputes. The Secretary General also engages in preventive diplomacy to address emerging conflicts and tensions before they escalate. The Secretary General also provides leadership in shaping UN policies and strategies to address pressing global challenges such as climate change, poverty, human rights violations. He advocates for international cooperation and mobilizes support for UN initiatives through public statements, speeches, and outreach activities. The Secretary General also promotes the implementation of UN's resolutions and decisions by member states. These administrative powers enable the Secretary General to fulfill his mandate as the Chief Administrative Officer of the UN and to advance the UN's goals of peace, security, development, and human rights on a global scale. Dear students, now we are going to discuss the financial powers of the Secretary General. The financial powers and functions of the UN Secretary General are crucial for managing the UN's finances effectively and ensuring transparency and accountability in the use of resources. The UN Secretary General oversees various financial aspects of the UN, including budget preparation, expenditure management, financial reporting, and oversight of financial regulations. Some of the key financial functions of the UN Secretary General are like the UN Secretary General plays a central role in the preparation of the UN's budget, which is submitted to the General Assembly for approval. The budget outlines the financial requirements for the UN's operations, programs, and activities for a specific period. The UN Security Secretary General also works closely with relevant departments and agencies to develop a comprehensive budget proposal that reflects the priorities and mandates of the UN. The UN Secretary General is also responsible for mobilizing financial resources to support the UN's activities and initiatives. This involves engaging with member states, international organizations, private sector entities, and other stakeholders to secure funding through voluntary contributions, assess contributions, and other sources. The UN Secretary General also advocates for increased financial support for priority areas such as peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and sustainable development. The UN Security Secretary General also oversees the management of the UN's expenditure to ensure that resources are being utilized efficiently and in accordance with the established policies and procedures. This includes monitoring budget execution, approving expenditures within authorized limits, and taking corrective action as needed to address financial challenges or discrepancies. The UN Secretary General also promotes cost saving measures and efficiency gains to optimize the use of available resources. The UN Secretary General is also responsible for preparing and presenting financial reports to the General Assembly, member states, and other stakeholders. These reports provide an overview of the UN's financial performance, including revenue, expenditures, assets, and liabilities. The UN Secretary General ensures that financial statements comply with international accounting standards and accurately reflect the financial position of the organization. The UN Secretary General also oversees the development and implementation of financial regulations and rules governing the management of the UN finances. These regulations establish the framework for budgeting, accounting, procurement, and other financial activities, ensuring transparency, integrity, and accountability in financial operations. The UN Secretary General monitors compliance with financial regulations and takes action to address any violations or irregularities. The UN Secretary General also identifies and assesses financial risks facing the UN and develops strategies to mitigate these risks effectively. This includes risks related to funding shortfalls, currency fluctuations, fraud, and financial mismanagement. The UN Secretary General also works with financial mismanagement. The UN Secretary General also works with relevant stakeholders to strengthen internal controls, improve risk awareness, and enhance financial resilience. to external shocks. Overall, the financial functions of the UN Secretary General are essential for ensuring the management of the UN's resources and the fulfillment of its mandates in promoting peace, security, development, and human rights worldwide. By effectively managing finances, the UN Secretary General contributes to the organization's credibility, effectiveness, and impact on the global stage. So, in today's lesson, we have seen that the United Nations Secretary General holds an important role within the UN system. He serves as Chief Administrative Officer of the UN, and he holds significant influence on the global stage. Dear students, we have also seen the appointment process of UN Secretary General, which is guided by the principles of multilateralism and diplomacy. This process reflects a careful balance of regional rotation, gender balance, and merit based selection. We have also seen in today's lecture the tenure of Secretary General. The tenure of the Secretary General, as I told you, is 5 years, but with the possibility of reappointment, which underscores the importance of fresh leadership while allowing for continuity and adaptability in addressing global challenges. We have also discussed administrative powers, financial powers of the Secretary General. In our next lecture, we are going to discuss the rest of the powers of the Secretary General, like representational and political powers, as well as we are going to explain the position of the Secretary General within the UN system. Thank you.